The Memory of Love, Chapter 9. They are alone, and it is such a long time since Adrian has seen alone. True, there is lushness in the trees and the foliage. The hills behind the city are densely green, but the soil is cracked and the earth raw. Adrian craves the sensation of soft grass beneath his feet, the darkness of dew. He would like to take his shoes off and walk across the lawn, feeling the blades between his toes. The hems of his trousers grow heavy and damp. It is an illusion. The grass is spiky and sharp. Walking across it would be like walking in hot coals. And it is quiet. At first, the silence, abrupt and arresting, pervaded everything. Now, as Adrian walks alongside the woman, he becomes aware for the first time of different sounds, murmurings and mutterings, muted sounds. He can hear the wind in the tops of palm trees, reminding him of spinnakers in the breeze, and he can hear the sea. They stop at the door of a long, low building. Okay, ready? The woman, who is called Ileana and works here, asks. Adrian nods. She pushes open the door. The smell hits him and clogs in the back of his throat. Fermented and feral. The smell of hiding places and of stale fear. He begins to breathe in short, shallow breaths and drawing air in through his mouth. The room is in twilight. Presently, he is about to make out 2 rows of beds and mattresses, each one with a figure lying or sitting on it. Eliana walks up the center aisle. Adrian follows her, aware of the stark sound of his shoes on the concrete floor, looking from side to side, taking in the stained mattresses, the marks on the walls, shadows of those who have leaned there. At their approach, some of the patients begin to stir. In front of a tall iron bed, Ileana holds, and so does Adrian. A man lies on his side on the bed, his head resting upon a coverless pillow. Hello, John, how are you? At the sound of her voice, the man holds himself around to face them both. I am well, doctor, he answers and begins to lever himself up slowly. How are you too? I'm fine, thank you, John. I have somebody with me today, another doctor from England. He'd like to know about us. The man on the bed turns his head to take Adrian into view. At the same time, as he pulls himself up into the sitting position, there is an intermittent scraping sound of metal upon metal. The noise seems tremendous in the quiet of the wall. Once he has righted himself, the man extends his hands and the noise starts again, as of something unraveling. For some reason, it makes Adrian think of ships. He looks down at the man's hands, wrists wrapped in rags, metal cuffs, hands clasped together in greeting. The sound stops abruptly, leaving a faint ringing in the air, as the man on the bed reaches the full extent of his chains. Wednesday. The call had come that morning from the police station. Adrian arrived to be taken to the same room by the same woman officer as when he had examined the young deaf boy. This time, she stood some distance from the door and allowed him to go forward alone. Inside the room was a man, apparently sleeping, curled up with his back to the door, his hands trapped between his knees. What's he doing here? Adrian asked, glancing at her over his shoulders. She shrugged. The family brought him. Has he been violent? "This is what they are saying," she said, in an offended tone. "They don't want him there. They say they are afraid of him, that he barricaded the door and wanted to attack anybody who came in. They worry he'll break the whole place down." "But the problem exactly? Why did you call me?" She hadn't even been bothered to look at him, except for a fleeting glance. Her eyes empty, face suffused with boredom. She tapped her temple with her forefinger. Adrian knocked at the door and entered the room, noting the rapid retreat of the policewoman. Once inside, he closed the door and stood with his back to it. There was the sound of heavy breathing. "Hello," he said. At the sound of his voice, the figure on the other side of the room moved an inch or so farther to the wall. The breathing hastened, a stream of garbled words. Adrian paused, then continued moving forward, announcing each action. "I hope you don't mind if I come a bit closer. I want to talk to you. Is that okay? I'll keep coming until you tell me to stop." The babbling grew in pitch and fervor with every step, but the man no longer seemed to be trying to move away. A few feet short of him, Adrian dropped down. So he was squatting, almost level to the figure. "My name is Adrian. I'm a doctor. What's your name?" A response of sorts. In that, the sounds grew quieter. Adrian waited. "I'm sure you must be hungry. Are you hungry? Would you like something to eat?" The murmuring quietened and ceased. Silence but for the sound of breathing. The figure began first to strain and then to rock, until with a great effort it flopped over, like a fish. In front of Adrian lay a young man, bound hand and foot. They wanted rid of him. Adrian made it clear that the provision of water and some food might hasten the eventuality. Using his own money, he managed to secure a loaf of bread and a small plastic bag of water and drinking straw. Not one of the police officers would acquire sense to run the errand himself. So Adrian had to wait until a person of sufficient insignificance, one of the ubiquitous small boys of the city, could be found. Adrian agreed to accompany the prisoner to the mental hospital. With the help of 2 male officers, he bundled the young man into a taxi, propping him up on the back seat. By then, he'd resumed his babbled discourse, as though complaining about his treatment, and was shivering violently. Adrian slid in alongside him. The young man flinched and huddled farther away. "It's okay," said Adrian, as he bent and undid the ropes that bound the young man's feet. The taxi driver, reluctant and sullen, demanded double the fare. The policeman's answering laugh contained not a trace of humor as he banged the roof of the vehicle with the flat of his hand. The thunderous sound reverberated around the inside of the vehicle, setting the young man off again. The taxi pulled away. Reluctant to leave his charge alone, Adrian waited inside the gates of the mental hospital, seated on a wooden bench. Next to him, the young man drew his knees up to his chin and pulled his t-shirt up over his face. At an open window, a woman, naked to the waist, stood shouting to unseen persons. There were people milling inside and outside the gates, though none appeared to be figures of authority. A couple of men were talking, bickering in the manner of long-term acquaintances. One had shown Adrian to the seat, but otherwise left him unattended. A bilge stealthily attempted to gain entry through the gates. Adrian was uncertain what to do next. He called to one of the pair of men. Yes, yes, said the man, smiling and holding up his hand, telling Adrian to wait. Adrian resumed his seat on the bench. The heat had risen. He was beginning to sweat. A man stood outside the gate, his ears and nose plugged with pepper, and shouted, "Don't talk to me like that. I am not a patient anymore." Next to Adrian, the young man rocked from side to side. In time, a man in a white short-sleeved shirt and white trousers appeared from around the corner. A nurse. He called to the woman at the window to be quiet. The woman promptly disappeared. One of the men standing at the gate gave him a broad wave, encompassing Adrian in the same gesture. Finally, Adrian got to his feet. The nurse led the way impassively at a metronomic pace. To Adrian was left the task of coaxing the young man along. As soon as they left the gateway, the silence began, which, combined with the manner of the nurse, seemed to quieten the young man, whose anxiety gave way to bewilderment. They were shown into a room, empty save for a desk, a chair, and a glass cabinet containing a number of textbooks. The nurse fetched another chair from outside. He pointed first at the young man and then at the chair remarkably. The young man obeyed shamblingly, sat keening from side to side. Adrian noticed how extraordinarily clean the nurse was. The evenness of his hair, the burnished skin, his clothes pristine. He watched him leave, closing the door behind him, all without a single word. A few minutes later, and the door opened again. The nurse held the door open for a sallow-skinned European woman. "Thank you, Salia," she said. She wore a smoked top over a skirt, a pair of slip-on casual shoes, dark red lipstick, and carried with her the smell of fresh cigarette smoke. Adrian covered his relief at seeing another white person by explaining what he knew of the patient. The woman stood listening, her hands in the deep pocket at the front of her smock, and looked him up and down. "Who the hell are you?" she asked. Together they watched as the impeccable nurse supervised the removal of the patient by two attendants in blue overalls. Standing balanced on the balls of his feet, arms crossed, a consistent 2 paces away, not afraid of the patient, afraid of getting dirty, thought Adrian. The woman introduced herself as Eliana. She was the second in charge, a psychologist. "We'll check for malaria first," Eliana said. "Sometimes it's as simple as that. The disease can cause hallucinations, as I'm sure you know, though families usually recognize the symptoms for themselves. Then we'll check for all the rest, starting with drug abuse. He seems to have calmed down at any rate, and we can give him some haloperidol to keep him quiet." Since Adrian had nowhere else to go, he'd asked to be shown around. Eliana glanced at her watch and then led the way outside. The facility survived pretty well. None of the buildings were destroyed. Dr. Attila. Coming towards them, the senior psychiatrist returning from his rounds, Adrian recognized the name from a report in the International Journal of Social Psychiatry. And though he often imagined the authors of reports imprecisely, in some vague way, invariably and archetypically, as thin, colorless, reedy academics of the man approaching them, he had been able to produce no mental image whatsoever. A certain awe attached itself to Attila's name. Adrian saw a broad-chested man, in a collarless shirt, slacks, and open sandals, gesturing to his left and right with huge hands flanked by a blue-clad attendant, as well as a number of others, who from their demeanor Adrian judged to be patient. "Let me introduce you," said Ileana, placing herself in the path of the psychiatrist, who had so far showed no particular signs of slowing. As she introduced Adrian, Attila glanced his way briefly, but did not offer his hand. Finally, he scratched his ear and said, "In whatever way we can help you, you are most welcome." "Thank you. Just let Salia know." "Salia? Our head nurse." Adrian thanked him again, then added he'd wait until he had looked around. He wanted to know about the services: occupational, therapeutic, recreational. Perhaps he could talk to all the staff. He'd welcome the opportunity to come back, and the social workers naturally. As he talked, Adrian wondered why he had never thought to come here before. "Of course, Ileana can deal with all that. Anything else you want, just ask." Despite the generosity of the words, there was something faintly bullish about the man's manner. In his posture, perhaps, the broad body, which never inclined towards Adrian, he waved his huge hand, had already begun to move away. Adrian would have liked the opportunity to continue the conversation, though perhaps not so publicly. All those people listening in, even the patients, as though they were part of it. It bothered him, this absence of privacy. They walked on. "Sorry about that," said Ileana. "He can be that way sometimes. We'll begin at Ward 3. She drew a packet of London cigarettes from the pocket of her smock, waved the packet at Adrian, who shook his head. She lit up and walked ahead, puffing. "As I was saying, and as far as I know, most of the inmates survive. There's not a place in the world, rich or poor, frankly, where madness doesn't make people afraid. Call it fear, though. Part of its respect, too. After the invasion of the city, the rebels left them alone. Attila was in charge all the time. They noted everywhere and set fire to people's houses, burnt hundreds alive. The poorest people, of course, always forced them to march into the city, to act as human shield for the fighters. There were atrocities on all sides. So when things turned even worse, especially during the occupation, people hid inside these walls, pretending to be crazy. Poetic, don't you think? This is, after all, an asylum. There were a couple of peacekeepers in here as well. I didn't read any of that in the reports. No, well, what about you? I mean, how long have you been here? Which agency are you with? She looked at him, threw her cigarette down, went to grind it with the toe of her shoe, but missed as the cigarette rolled away down a faint incline. She didn't bother to pursue it, nor to answer his question. They had reached the door, gray painted, of a long, low building, the shape of a bank. She paused, with her hand on the handle. "Okay, ready?" she asked. Adrian nodded. He is not ready, though, for this. He isn't yet able to make sense of it. But he will. Attila's manner, the silence that overlays the entire place. They keep the patients dragged and chained. The man in front of him has his hands out and clasped together. It is a way people here have to say hello. A shorthand to an actual handshake. From the man chained to the bed, the gesture looks remarkably like prayer. "Tell the doctor what brought you here," Ileana says. "I cut my father. My father brought me here." "Why did you cut your father?" "He was sitting on the veranda. It was one night, a bad night. I was afraid. I didn't cut him." "So why do you say that you did?" "I saw the wound." Afterwards, as they leave the ward, Adrian asked, "What's his diagnosis?" "Psychosis, drug-induced. And the drug of choice? Cannabis mostly. There isn't much else anyone can afford. There's a bit of heroin, brown, it's called here. But that's a lot more expensive, obviously, and has to come in from elsewhere. Most of them on this world are the same. All cannabis? Yes, she replies, turning to meet his gaze as she says the word. And then he was transferred from the military hospital after Attila intervened, wounded in action. I think the father sought Attila's help. So he saw action. I believe so. Though I'm not sure of the details, you'd have to ask Dr. Attila about that. John's been in and out of here for the best part of a decade. The war began in 91, and I'm not sure exactly when he was discharged. Certainly, the army was where he began to use drugs. It was encouraged among the new recruits. They called it booster morale. As far as Dr. Attila is concerned, he is a casualty of war. So now his answer is to keep the man chained. She regards him for a moment in silence, dips her chin and looks at the floor. Looks like you dropped something, she says, pointing. His eyes travels to the floor. There's nothing he can see. Where? Right here, she points. Adrian sees nothing but a patch of linen, curled and broken. He frowns. What is it? Oh, about $2 million, I think. I don't understand. What it will cost to put in a proper security asylum infrastructure, staff training. They are on the other side of the door. Eliana reaches into her pocket for her cigarettes and lighter. She turns away, trading smoke. I'm sorry. I just want to know about the treatment methods. We have a method, she says. We call it cold turkey. Eliana walks and smokes. Adrian, unsure of his response, walks alongside her, waiting for her to say something more, realizing she does not intend to. So why did Dr. Attila say exactly, she says, laughs briefly and gives him a humorous smile. Now you get it. You should have been here at the start. But of course you weren't. Nobody was. You all turn up when it's over. Shit. And throws her butt into a flower bed. At her office, Eliana unlocks the door with a key she draws from her small pocket, crosses the room, and plugs a kettle into the wall. Back in the 1980s, the country was being run into the ground. Attila was already working here by then. On his own, he trained abroad and came back after his studies were over. I think there was a Brit in charge up until that point, but gradually they were leaving and being replaced by Africans. He must have been pretty young to take on such a responsibility. At that time, the population he was treating was pretty much the same as anywhere else. Schizophrenic, psychotics, depressives, the usual breakdown of nutcases. Then, at some point, that began to change. Eliana makes tea in a small silvered pot, Lipton yellow label. It takes an age to brew, and even then, the tea achieves no more than a pale gold. In the early 1980s, there was an influx of new admissions. Attila saw it fast. He was the one admitting them. They were mostly young men, late teens and early 20s. They came from the city, but also from the provinces, either without family or thrown out by their families, all with drug-related disorders. Within a few years, the makeup of his population had inverted. Those who once made up no more than a tenth were now the overwhelming majority. She pauses to stir and then to pour the tea, hands Adrian a cup. There's no air conditioning in the room, no fridge either. The windows are all closed. What he'd in fact really like is a glass of cold water. But he accepts the tea without complaint. He wants to get over the bad start. he seems to have made with Eliana. He wrote to the government, the newspapers, something was coming. Of course, no one took him seriously. The government ministers laughed and said he was as batty as his patients. But he went on to the World Health Organization. The government began to get irritated with him. Farkas, he was trying to warn them. And then in the 1990s, whoosh, she throws both hands dramatically up in the air. Hundreds, thousands of young men high on drugs and very, very angry. No jobs, no family, no future, nothing to lose. The thing that was coming had arrived. In the silence, Adrian drinks his tea. Eliana fetches a tin from the top of her filing cabinet and offers him a biscuit from a selection. He takes one with jam in the middle, like the ones he used to enjoy as a child, licking out the sticky synthetic center. He hasn't had one in years. Eliana opens a window and a faint trickle of breeze reaches him. On the wall behind her desk, a sign reads, "Some days it's just not worth chewing through the straps." The conversation picks up and strays on to other subjects. He asks her where she trained, as a way of trying to locate where in Eastern Europe she is from. Tel Aviv. Ah. She smiles for the first time, knowing she has confounded him. My initial training was in Bucharest. On the way back to the front gate, they pass a building, smaller than the rest, and set slightly apart. Outside, it is a washing line, upon which are strung several lappers, lengths of printed cloth, limp with age and wear. At the back, a woman is bent over a cooking fire, the women's quarter. "Can we take a look?" asks Adrian. "Don't see why not." Eliana shrugs, tosses her half-smoked cigarette onto the ground, and leads the way, introducing Adrian to the female attendants at the door. Inside the room, the beds are fewer and therefore more widely spaced than inside the men's ward. The rank order is less present, possibly because the windows are open. None of the patients is restrained. Some are sitting or lying on their beds. At the far end, a woman is folding clothes nearest to the door. Another sits cross-legged on her bed. She looks up at Adrian and smiles. Suddenly and warmly, one eye is cloudy. Her hand plucks at the bedclothes as she babbles nonsense. They are, Eliana explains, mostly schizophrenics, some personality disorder. Few are violent, though they have to keep an eye on them. With women, the families will try to keep them at home, seek treatment through local healers or religious leaders. So there are relatively few of them here. Do they have the local methods? He asks. It's just care in the community, under another name, she replies. The attendant, who has been shadowing them ever since they entered the room, says something to Eliana, who stops, holds up her hand, signaling for Adrian to wait. She moves forward, stopping a few faces in front of a woman who is standing facing them from the other side of her bed, sullen and motionless, a hairbrush in her hand. Eliana speaks to her for a moment. She turns to Adrian. This one's not good with men. They had a bit of trouble with her the other day, apparently. I hadn't heard about it. If you've seen enough, we may as well go. Sure. Eliana gives instructions regarding the patient's medication to the attendant. Adrian waits, looking around him. There is a woman lying in one of the beds, curled upon her side, hands under her chin, her eyes open, staring into the middle distance. He takes a step forward and peers at her, but moves no nearer, less concerned with his own safety than subverting Eliana's authority. When Eliana joins him again, he asks, "What do you know about this woman?" It is her, he is sure of it, the woman who came to see him in the hospital and who approached him later on the street. She had fled then and never returned. Eliana tilts her head on one side and peers at the woman's face. I've never seen her before, I don't think. Mostly it's Attila who deals with the women's ward. She turns to the attendant, speaking the local dialect. She was admitted 2 days ago, she interprets haltingly. Her attendant given to listening to the attendant. Somebody brought her. She's not sure who, but it wasn't a family member. Somebody off the street. She's confused, apparently. A pause. That's it. She is about to continue walking when the attendant speaks again, saying something which causes Iliana to raise her eyebrows and grunt with faint surprise. Every few months or so, she reappears. Every few months. It's a regular occurrence, apparently. Through the open office door, Adrian can see Attila bent over his desk. Thankfully, he is alone. Adrian knocks softly on the door. He is suddenly nervous. The memory of the man's earlier manner and also, now, the possibility of being refused. There is no reason, after all, for the man to say yes except as a professional courtesy. Adrian's silver of hope rests on Attila, seeing it that way. At the second knock, Attila waves him in without looking up and points at the empty chair. Adrian obeys. Attila signs off on the document in front of him and rises, paper in hand. One moment, he says to Adrian, Salia. A moment later, the nurse glides into view and Attila hands him the document, issuing instructions as he does so. He returns and sits down behind the desk, regarding Adrian with no particular sign of hope. How may I help you? Suddenly, Adrian is in two minds whether to ask about the woman at all, but now he is expected to say something. Thanks for letting me look around. My pleasure, replies Attila, and inclines his head without smiling, as though he means nothing of the sort. He leans back with his hands spread out on the desk in front of him and waits for Adrian. There's a patient on the women's ward. Adrian plunges straight in. She was admitted a few days ago. I'm told not for the first time. He describes the woman he has just seen. Attila nods once. Yes, he is aware of the patient, Adrian continued, telling Attila how the same woman had been to see him at the hospital. In the moment, he decides to omit any mention of the encounter in the street. The psychiatrist listens expressionlessly and without comment until Adrian finishes. So, what is it you think I can help you with? Adrian takes a breath. I'd like your permission to examine her, if I may. By all means. It had been that easy, Adrian realizes. He has been holding his breath and exhales, wondering why he'd allowed himself to become so tense. Come back when it suits you. I will inform Salia. Her notes will be made available to you. Thank you very much. We are, says Attila, turning upon Adrian affirmatively, at your service. It is enough for Adrian, who rises to go. By the time he reaches the door, Attila's attention had shifted back to the paperwork on his desk. For the second time, in the same day, and with Iliana's help, Adrian succeeds in securing a taxi to himself. Despite the heat of the speakers relaying rap music directly behind his head, he luxuriates across the plastic-covered back seat. For the first time since his arrival, he feels a small sense of triumph. At a T-junction next to a garage, traffic policeman is waving his arms in the air, rotating them like windmills. It seems to be a fashion among the new recruits to develop an individual style, a kind of a semaphoric signature. On three sides, the traffic stops and starts in confusion. Inevitably, there is a collision. Minor but chaos ensues as the two drivers get out of their vehicles and a crowd, including the traffic policeman, gathers. Adrian's driver exhales happily, turns up the music and pulls out around the crackers, skirting the cars and people, turning right down a road Adrian has never been before. Suddenly, the way ahead of them is clear. Adrian winds down the windows and lets in the air. Salt and marshy. In between the speed bumps, the driver accelerates. The houses come to an end. There is an expanse of scrub, a view of the sea and a bridge, stretching out ahead of them. As they cross it, Adrian sees to the left an inlet leading to swampy open land. To the right, the horizon, a straight blue-gray line. His thoughts are brought back from the mental hospital. The bridge. He sits up and looks around properly. Over there, the peninsula, and this bridge is the one Elias Cole described, exactly as he described Adrian is certain of it. Julius's bridge.